Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me know when you are situated. Okay. We are unmuted for a second. Yep. Okay, okay, everyone, it's 12:17. You've got everyone back in the room. Hopefully you all are back in your respective virtual offices and can hear us. Mr. Mott, can you hear us okay for a test? Yep, great, wonderful. So at this point, if you're following along, we are on rebuttal. We're gonna have some, we're gonna hear from the conservation group first. They have remaining unused portion of their initial 60 minutes allocated to be used for this rebuttal. So Mr. Parsons, I'll have Tammy unmute you and let you take it from here.
There's 37 minutes left of your time.
Thank you very much. Jeff Parsons on behalf of the conservation groups. I don't think I'll need 37 minutes. I do want to talk a little bit about what we heard from the CMA presentation. Obviously, I was encouraged by Dr. Finley's presentation and the list he gave of great resources, existing resources for technical guidance. I think that will be, that's great input and is something hopefully the division can move forward with. I wanted to be clear that I understand there are some resource limitations for the division to be able to just sort of take on a guidance document of that nature. So there's no expectation that it's some kind of immediate, immediate thing that they have to do. However, I do believe the consensus was that some type of guidance of that nature would be helpful down the road. So I wanted to just reiterate that it seems like there's some agreement that a technical guidance document would be helpful. Getting to the issue of this paragraph E in Rule 3.1.6, there was a characterization that perhaps it's not an exemption, and I think it is. I think the only way to read that paragraph is to create an exemption for amendments that the division thinks will not impact water quality or the hydrologic balance. And that's simply not in the statute. There was a lot of discussion in terms of examples of a mine, for instance, that has historic pollution and now all of a sudden has to come in for an amendment as if they would be subject to some heightened burden. And I want to point out that same debate occurred during the legislative process, and there is a specific exemption from the end date requirement for mines that have water pollution problems predating the effective date of the act, that January 1st, 2019 date. And that's reflected in F little I. And it says that there's an exemption for water quality impacts that have occurred or are occurring for which no reasonably foreseeable end date for the water quality treatment can be established, where those were either unforeseen at the time of the approval of the reclamation plan or existing at the mine site permitted on or before January 1st, 2019. So when we're under no scenario would a mine that had pre-existing water pollution problems, if have to, historic pollution problems on their site, have to come in and demonstrate that end date requirement. So the historic discharge issue, I think, is for lack of a better term, a red herring here. It's already written into the statute. It's already exempt from the end date requirement. What we're talking about is where a mine comes in, an operation comes in for an amendment, where that operation has water quality problems. I think the intent and the effect of the bill, HB 191113, was to wrap those operations into a end date requirement scenario, because we need to get a handle on those. And if the mine is going to go through an amendment process to expand, then it has to be held accountable for the water pollution problems that were created and are being created. Whether it's expand the waste rock facility, I mean, what that essentially means is that lengthening the time of, expanding the mine. That's a scenario that's directly contemplated to be covered by HB 191113. So I see great problems with E. I think the scenarios that were presented should not be compelling to the board, because if it is truly historic mine pollution, there's an exemption for it. And if it's not, and there's a problem with that water quality, it ought to be addressed and dealt with in the permitting process, in the amendment process. And so that makes a lot of sense. It goes back to this issue the division started with they were talking about 6.4.7, and it talks about making sure the whole mine site is the water quality of the whole mine site is accounted for, and this is consistent with that. The rules fit together very nicely in that regard. I think E will be and particularly with the broadening that's suggested or proposed by the Colorado Mining Association slide that was presented earlier today, it will be a cause for not just concern, but confusion. It will be a place where operators will attempt to navigate their way into that exemption. And perhaps it will be a place that will be litigated in the future unnecessarily, because the law was written without that exemption, and to insert it into the rules is not within the authority granted under the statute. And I just to point out, Mr. Sanderson talked about the standard here is substantial evidence, which he's right. It's not a very high standard. We put that in there for the specific reason of not creating an undue burden for the mining industry, yet still making sure that there was information available and a look conducted, an analysis conducted on the water quality issues at a mine site. And so the idea that having to meet that substantial evidence standard would put an unreasonably high burden on the operator, I think, is belied by the nature of that standard. It is really just enough evidence that a reasonable person could agree with you. It doesn't have to be, it's not even a 50%. It's not a preponderance of the evidence. It's not beyond a reasonable doubt. It's just, you have to be able to put up something that says, here's how it's going to work. Here's how we're going to be able to walk away from this mine site. And it's not going to be a tremendous burden. If the company comes in or the operator comes in and they've got an amendment that's not going to affect water quality and not going to affect the hydrologic balance, and the mine otherwise has no major issues with water quality, it's going to be an easy proof. It's not going to be a high burden. What this does, eliminating that paragraph E, what it does is it makes sure that where a mine comes in, where an operator comes in for an amendment, even if it's, and again, we're not talking about technical revisions. So these are only, by definition, an amendment is a significant change to the reclamation plan or an addition or an expansion, effectively, an addition of affected land. Where they come in for that type of approval, it ensures that we're addressing water quality. It ensures that we're protecting the long-term water quality at the site. And that's exactly what HB 1911-13 was supposed to do. And that's how it was written and negotiated. That this very amendment was proposed to say where it's a technical amendment to the reclamation plan, it doesn't have to comply with these provisions, and that amendment, legislative amendment, failed. And that means the legislative intent was indeed to be comprehensive, to make sure that we addressed where there are water quality issues and someone comes in for an amendment to their permit, that those issues are addressed. So again, I would ask the board to strike paragraph E, move forward with suggesting or instructing the division to implement guidance at as they're able, given their resources. And I did not want to forget about that last provision in the exhibits in Rule 6. Again, that little provision in there says that in those exhibits, the operator must demonstrate a reasonably foreseeable end date respecting water quality treatment as required. And it says in Rule 3.1.61 G through H, and I think it ought to say F through I. So that's, I think, a minor change, but I think it's important to get that right. So those are the points I wanted to address, and I do appreciate the time, and I'm happy to answer any questions or provide any other input I can.
I had a question on sort of the discussion around E and how it might relate or not relate from your point of view on to subparagraph B, where the operators obviously have to be in compliance with federal and Colorado water quality laws. I guess to me, I'm hearing that B addresses keeping those mines that you're mentioning, mines that have ongoing water quality issues. Do you feel like B adequately addresses that? I guess the two seem like they might be trying to work together, or how do you feel like B influences E or doesn't? Terrible question, I apologize.
No, it's a great question. It's a great question. And I think this was referred to earlier, that a lot of these mines have existing water quality, existing water pollution treatment permits through the CDPHE. And that's what B is obviously getting at, that it has to continue to comply with those permits. I think what we're getting at with the end date is looking past the time when the mining company is on site operating a mine. Oftentimes, when the company's operating and the mine's going full bore, there may not be an immediate concern with respect to pollution problems, because the mine's on site, it's got that permit in place, it's doing its work. It's at the end of the day, it gets to this walk away reclamation plan idea. And what I'm talking about is if there are issues coming up, it's where they may not be able to fix those problems and be able to do that walk away. So you can treat water we can have perpetual treatment. We know that that's a possibility. The whole point of this bill, HB 1911-13, was to get away as far as possible from relying on perpetual water treatment as the long-term solution for water quality at these mine sites. And so that's what I'm getting at when I say if an amendment comes in with a mine that's having issues, not necessarily that it's having issues immediately with compliance with its water quality permit, because that'll obviously be addressed. The Water Quality Control Division has enforcement authority. This board has enforcement authority. Citizens have enforcement authority under the Clean Water Act. But the problems that arise that are harder to get at, and what HB 191113 was supposed to do is with regard to those long-term problems. If a mine is having issues and it appears that their walk-away solution is not evident, then yes, it ought to have to come in and demonstrate how it's going to do that walk-away. So that's how I think those two interact. It's really a temporal sort of distinction between paragraph B is ensuring that water quality is protected in the near term while the mine is operating, and the end date requirement is there to make sure at the end of the day we've got water quality protections that don't rely on perpetual active treatment.
Great, thank you. Thank you for interpreting my question. That was exactly something I understand.
Okay.
Any other questions for Mr. Parsons right now? Mr. Parsons, did you have anything else you needed to add or comment right now?
Not at the moment. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. So we will move on and hear rebuttal from Colorado Mining Association. Same thing, they have the unused portion of, they have 26 minutes left of their initial 60 minutes allotment. And Tammy will unmute the commenters here.
Let me just check to see if you can hear me, because I have a notice that the host is not allowing me to unmute, so
We hear you. Yep, I can hear you and see you.
thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'll be short so we can move along. I think it's interesting on how these hearings kind of come down to one or two issues at the end that we all focus on, and it's just seeing maybe it's the nature of rulemakings, but I think I would just ask you to read that subsection E yourself. I sent around to all the parties and the division and a copy of the slides that our people used, including the language that I suggested and be considered that's consistent with our statement of basis and purpose. If you'll recall, if you had an opportunity to look at our pre-hearing statement from CMA, at the end on page 8 or so, I think we had some proposed language that is interestingly consistent with what the subsection E would accomplish. And so I would ask that you, before you deliberate, take a look at that. And when you read E, I respectfully disagree with Jeff Parsons, who's a great lawyer, but it doesn't read like an exemption. I'd like it to read like an exemption, maybe, because it'd take a lot of work away. But all it does is say, if you're in these categories, flag that for us and make the case of why you are either have no impacts or no material impacts or whatever it is. And I think that's a useful exercise of discretion by the rulemaking. It doesn't say what the outcome is going to be. That's what an exemption does. An exemption tells you what the outcome is going to be. And so I think I just respectfully disagree with that assertion. I guess the other thing that I would ask that you consider as you work through your deliberations is that this categories of mines, there are those that are going to be new mines. That's kind of an easier thing to talk about if they have to make a demonstration to figure out what the geology is. Then there are these existing mines that could be in place for and tapping an ore resource that miners were working on in the 1860s. And there is no end date for those mines. I would submit that the legislature did not intend to freeze in time all existing mines so that they could not have an amendment because they have to dream up an end date. I think that debate will, or that ultimate debate will occur down the road. But I think gathering information about this as we go is an important step. And so that's what E would accomplish as we suggest be amended. So I would ask you to consider that. And I want to thank you for your attention. And we'll see you later in the process today and tomorrow.
Thank you very much. Any questions from the board at this point? Okay, thank you very much.
Jim, did you folks want to, in your earlier presentation, you had some additional language to E?
That you showed on your slide. Can you unmute him again? Cammy? Somebody answer.
Jim
Oh,
Sanderson.
Oh, sorry.
Hello?
There you go.
Whoever was speaking did not come through clearly. So if you
All
could
right.
restate your question.
Jim, earlier you folks had some revisions to this parent E that went to the effect, or I can't read my writing, or when an amendment without a material impact. You have some proposed language to insert into E. Are you still wanting to do that?
Yeah, we would ask that. And I think I just put it on the screen for you. I'm sure it's difficult to see across the room on the big screen, but I also sent this around to all the parties as well as to the division staff and Jeff Fugate. So everybody has it. They can, if your board doesn't have it, they can perhaps print a copy out. But this is the language that I was referring to. It's those two categories. It's the one category that Jeff Parsons talked about as having, dry mine. There's no water quality nexus. Fine. Let's move on. It'd be a very low burden to show that, and so this would ask the proponent to make that showing by substantial evidence. That's consistent with the rest of the regulation. The second category is this existing mine, for example, that has water treatment in place. It's related to legacy as well as active current operations. It's being treated, but there is no end date for when it might cease, and that work has not been done. And an amendment is sought, which would have the effect of needing an amendment, but not having a material effect on water treatment needs. In other words, you wouldn't have to have a bigger plant or change the treatment method or how, and you look at it professionally. And again, the substantial evidence test is that a reasonable person would agree that by doing this, we're really not going to have a material impact on the end date of whenever treatment is not going to be required anymore at that site. That's all hypothetical, and we'd have to wait until there is such a circumstance. But this amendment, the way it's written, you have those two examples, and it says if you fall in one of those examples, submit a statement and a demonstration of that for review and approval. Now, approval then has to be made within the context of the other parts of the rule. I look at this as a screening device to help focus on what I hope would be easier applications for amendments. I would remind you that, as I said earlier today, there's anxiety out there among the operators who are not lawyers. the substantial evidence test doesn't mean anything to them particularly. And they want to, they're concerned about what kind of effort is going to be undertaken to just to make relatively minor changes in their permit or their plan. This gives a way to highlight what they would assert or that, but they still have to make it through the screening of the, or not the screening, but the tests of the balance of the regulation. So it's not an exemption, but it does focus attention on those two issues that you heard a lot about today. Thank you.
Thank you for clarification.
Okay, Mr. Sanders, this is Russ Means with the division. Just so you're aware, on our red line version, this language is proposed and stuff and that, but we went ahead and put that up there so the board can see that.
Oh, good.
So, and that it's doesn't mean that it's approved or anything like that. We're just putting it up there for the board. So
That's all we can ask for, that it's up for review. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Sorry.
No, that's fine. That's great.
Yes, Mr. Sanderson, so I think you mentioned the word material comes out of NEPA language, and that was kind of where you drew some of that inspiration from. My concern is really related to that anxiety that you just mentioned. I can see some concerns here about what one person feels like is a material effect and what another does not. And that this becomes a real gray area between operators, division staff, board. You know, I'm concerned about some of the ambiguity of language.
Well, I guess I would respond in this way. I think the word significant is a word that's in NEPA. Material is not, but I think they're both defined terms. I would submit that in my experience, I've been an environmental lawyer for many decades, and my personal approach is to try to find consensus among people who are affected and interested in a proposal to avoid litigation at all costs, and have been successful in many instances in that regard. You know, that doesn't mean there won't be litigation. I submit that this new law will be subject to litigation because it's new and it has, it's a complicated, you know, I'm sure each of you, when you read the regulation that basically parrots the law 316, you thought, man, this is a mouthful. And there will be litigation about this. And I would suggest that using the word material here, you know, which is, you know, basically defined as whether something is important or trivial or not. And that's a discretion call the division will have to make in the first instance, and perhaps the board. And I just don't see a way to avoid certain ambiguities that are going to be tested in the actual decision making. I think this calling out the screening process to identify these two examples of types of amendments that may come in allows some focus on those so that the operator knows that he or she should make those distinctions and then have the demonstration that the project is approvable with the other parts of the regulation. So I understand your concern. I would submit that it's not a concern that can be avoided entirely when you're dealing with a complex subject like this. Thank you.
I appreciate your opinion. Thank you.
Anyone else? Thank you so much. Now we will hear a rebuttal from the division. They're on 26. Division, you have 37 minutes left as well.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, All right, Russ Means with Vision. I would like to take the time and stuff to talk a little bit about these guidance documents. There's been a lot of time talking about it. And it's very important. And we heard this stuff in our informal processes and our formal process and stuff. So we recognize that. And that, and I don't want to throw it out with the wash, if you will, and stuff, but it's not part of the rulemaking. Nothing in our rules is talking about guidance documents. So with that said, I would like to kind of tell you a little bit about what we do. The division has working groups. These working groups consist of our environmental protection specialists with certain expertise. When we talk about engineering, we have a working group for that. Bonding, vegetation, we have one for groundwater. We also have a separate one for surface water. These EPSs and stuff are get together and they work on different projects. Their number one project is the things that we have to do. By statute, we have to review permits, we have to do our inspections, we have to do a lot of things. Those are the things we have to do. Then we have a list of the things that we want to do. The want to do's are things like the designated mining chemical list that we have. We have other documents and stuff like the engineering stability analysis stuff that the board did that. So this is on the list. And I want to make that really important, impress upon that. The submitted guidance and stuff that the both sides of stuff submitted to you are very, very useful. They're great literature. I read through them several times myself, and those will be forwarded on to the groundwater working group once this rulemaking is over, so that we can start working on that. But both sides have admitted that this is a huge lift, and to have everybody say that the board should be directing the division to get this done. I can commit that we're going to get it done. I can't commit to the time frame. What I'm afraid of is you're going to, we're going to go down a rabbit hole here, and you're going to give me staff, the division, some kind of a directive and stuff to get this done, and my staff can't get it done because of the other required workload that's on there. I just wanted to go on record as saying that so that the board understood that. So I can commit that we're going to work on it, but I would ask that we not be committed to some kind of a time frame and stuff that I'm afraid we just can't. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, and we're going to have a discussion from there.
First, let's see if our camera's on here.
It wasn't.
Everything for central camera.
Yeah. Our camera's not on.
Mr. Mott, can you confirm that even though their camera wasn't on, that you still heard what Mr. Means said? Yes, you did. Okay, good.
All right. Cool. All right, very good.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Jeff Diaz. I represent the division. I appreciate the time that you all are taking to consider the proposed rules by your staff. As you've heard from the parties this morning, you've done significant work to reach consensus on the majority of the rules that have been presented to you. That's a kind of a reflection and a recognition of hard work of us and Michael and Travis and Jenny put in this process to kind of give the stakeholders a good starting draft. It's kind of the starting point in the informal process months ago, and continue to work openly with the stakeholders to kind of narrow it down to the most recent draft. And then in the last few weeks, based on these previous statements, meetings with stakeholders, division produced kind of a final draft, trying to incorporate some of the comments from some accommodations to the perspectives we were hearing from the stakeholders. And I think we've essentially narrowed it down to, just a couple rules that are still being kind of discussed and disputed. Obviously, the big one is 3.1.6(1)(e), that subsection. Yep.
Excuse me, can you get closer to the microphone?
Try.
Getting a little garbled.
It's in my camera, right, Kim?
Yes.
Let me know if I'm not talking loud enough. I'll use
That's much better.
Yeah. So I feel like I've been yelling at people over Zoom for 2.5 years. So what I wanted to do is take some time to kind of explain at least the division's perspective and purpose behind that 3.1.6 language. I don't believe it was drafted as an exemption that doesn't exist in 1113. That was clearly not the intent or purpose. And I think as drafted, I think maybe Mr. Sanderson mentioned that expressly there is no exemption there. There is no kind of indication as to what the division may determine once it receives that demonstration. The intent really was a data gathering effort. But at the front end of an application process, the division wanted applicant operators to submit a demonstration explaining why, in this instance, there was no anticipated impacts to water quality or hydrologic balance. This language has been, I think, tweaked a little bit through some of the discussion today. The kind of the situations or scenarios that were contemplated by the division as they drafted this language were situations where on their face there was no impact to hydrologic balance or water quality. I think probably the poster example for this is somebody mines outside their permit boundary. Division pursues an enforcement action. The board finds the violation and orders that they add that impacted acreage in their permit. Because they're adding acreage that by statute and by rule has to be an amendment. Say they're adding 3 acres into a 50-acre mine site. The practical application of having them go through the full 1113 analysis seemed to be a little illogical, not necessarily within kind of the scope or intent of that legislation. Again, we're talking about a minor situation that on its face is not going to impact water quality. It's simply adding acreage into an existing mine site. There's other examples like that where, again, there's no impact or consideration of water quality impacts. It truly is just some action that requires amending into a permit. Some of the hypotheticals that the CMA offered up today, they get a little more complicated because those do touch water or potentially touch water. That's not the purpose of this subparagraph. It's not to handle those types of situations. It really is kind of a narrow upfront demonstration by applicant operator as to why 1113 is not applied to this particular application. The other part of this that was contemplated by the division was it's coming in as part of the application process, or the amendment process. As you all know, that's a public process. All of that material is publicly available. It's subject to comment and subject to objection from the public. So there's a hearing aspect to this. There's a transparency aspect. If an applicant operator submits a demonstration that somebody disagrees with or wants to object to, there is a process in place for them to do that. They can raise their concerns with the division can address it, or they can object and have that matter go before the board in a contested hearing. The other aspect of this, which I think further explains why this is not an express exemption, is the division may not agree with their demonstration. They may review what the applicant offers up and determine, I'm not sure that this kind of satisfies what the division is looking for. You need fuller analysis under 1113. Again, this gets very tricky very quickly because a lot of this is dealing with hypotheticals, which is always a complicated thing for staff to deal with, particularly on this subject where so many of the applications and proposals that the division receives are going to be very site-specific, very fact-specific. And so I just wanted to provide a little bit of background on kind of that subpart B and where it came from. Honestly, I think the division offered up that language thinking it was going to be a compromised position between the positions that we received in the stakeholder comments, reader statements and the rebuttal statements. This language did not exist in the original draft. Some of what's required here arguably already exists in Rule 6.4.7 when we're dealing with hydrologic balance issues through exhibits. And so I believe the authority to require this kind of demonstration already exists in the rules. It just simply made sense to specifically tailor that concept to the divisions dealing with the 1113 concepts. So any questions about that before I move on to some other points?
What it seems to me is that the addition of that is just a different, that you have several between E, F, G that talks about amendments to permits. And it's just another circumstantial piece with very low impact that helps, from my perspective, clarify and, to make that process simpler. Is that true? I mean, I'm trying to just differentiate, but you have several amendments, amendment of reclamation plans throughout this whole section. This is just subdividing it to a unique set of circumstances that may exist that you just described.
Right, and sub E is kind of the new language. I'm sure I'm watching the same thing. So all of the other language in rule 3.1.6, it's statutory language. So that is cut and paste from 1113. Correct, right? We didn't modify that language. I think as Mr. Sanderson described it, it is a mouthful. You have to read it a few times to digest it all, but there's purpose behind that language, and we didn't want to simplify, we didn't want to modify it, we didn't want to kind of lose some of the intent there. And I think that was kind of supported by all of the stakeholders, is they liked that there was no modification of that statutory language. We see E, as you described it, as kind of an additional data that the division will receive at the front end of an application process for review and consideration. That type of information would be presented in some form in the review process anyway. Arguably, any mine would have to comply with the requirements of the exhibits in the regulations. We decided it fit nicely here as a more site-specific explanation of what the division is looking for as the charter 1113 requirements.
Does the insertion of the CMA proposed language cover or muddy water?
I think it changes it significantly. Adding in insignificant or material change, it does broaden that. Again, the intent behind this subparagraph E was to look at those on their face, no impacts to water quality and hydrologic balance. I think the proposal from CMA, and obviously I've not had much time to kind of review it with DRMS, although it is in line with some of their comments there, so it's not completely 11th hour scale. I think we do get into the gray area of whether or not we're changing some of the requirements of the
With that too, can we just simplify it a little bit more even? So it sounds like industry is not looking at this as an exemption. I'm hearing conservation groups really wanting to make sure this is not an exemption. I'm not hearing that from division as an intent of this language at all. So, not being a lawyer, I'm gonna throw out some words and you guys can tell me what we think of them. What if we added a sentence to the end of E that says, this is not intended as an exemption to paragraph I below, which is pretty darn clear of no permit shall be approved where perpetual water treatment is proposed as a final reclamation. And I would amend I to read, no permit or amendment shall be approved where perpetual water treatment. And I wonder if just by blatantly stating it, we might be able to avoid some of this concern over how E is intended.
If I could have you repeat your suggestion.
Yeah. Yeah,
We'll have Travis.
well, and
Yeah.
I already apologize for my lack of legal language here. I would say this is not intended as an exemption to paragraph I below.
Paragraph I below.
Yeah, just well, like 3 point, whatever, however you want to reference I below.
And sorry, you're, okay, I as opposed to.
Yes, sorry.
Little I,
Yes,
got it.
right.
And then you go to I where you were, Travis, if you go to
Travis,
I.
go
or
ahead.
Yeah, is it parent and then parent F?
Parent,
Parent.
Parent
Is it
I.
just parent I?
Yes.
yeah,
Thank you.
right there.
And then I would add this amendment to I that reads, no permit or amendment shall be approved with perpetual water treatment as proposed as the final reclamation.
Say
And I
that
wonder
again.
if we're,
No permit or. No, at the end,
To the very beginning.
right at the very beginning, no permit,
At the beginning of it. Oh,
No,
no permit or amendment,
right?
yeah.
Yep.
oh,
And then I don't know, definitely greater brains in this room than my own, but I wonder if that starts hitting on what everyone's concerned about, right? Like that, it's very clear that it's not an exemption. It's not, that E is not intended as an exemption. It allows for that review period that the division and the operator can work through to make sure that we're not talking about, we're not creating an exception. And maybe still is that middle ground that everyone was hoping for in the pre-hearing conversations. Throwing,
All right, we'll put it there, and I'm sure that conservation will want to weigh in. So
yeah, please,
but we'll,
for sure.
maybe when we get to deliberation, conversation and stuff, yeah, we can go back, but we haven't memorialized up here.
I think it provides due diligence from both sides, conservation and the industry, about transparency. So when there's a site-specific issue, it can be, hey, in the initial permit, this was already shown as a potential concern. Therefore, that can kind of streamline like the facts, as you said, about the needs.
We'll chew on that.
I wanted to quickly move off this subparagraph E. It's enforced now, if there's any other questions, if not, I'll move on, we'll just circle back.
I'm writing and thinking at the same time.
And Jeff, can you try to speak up a little bit?
Yeah, am I still not loud enough?
I can't hear you very well, so.
So I've just been trying to kind of figure this one out a bit and acknowledging that, paragraph B, which you said, you took straight from the statute talking about water quality standards and that goes, obviously, that's how things operate currently. And, we were talking about, say, for example, with reporting, if you've got some water quality standards that you typically would already do in your annual report or monthly report to CDPHE, it's already within your, process that the operator CCs DRMS in that sense. So I'm just asking, and I'm sure there's been lots of discussion, probably more on the larger operator side of things, but how do you reconcile this in saying there's absolutely, to your language that you just proposed, not going to be perpetual water treatment when a different agency is the one making the water quality standards? That may or may not have been, say, made, when was the water quality standard for lead made? When was it made for arsenic? The unintended consequences of, obviously, when that water standard comes through, the intention is water quality, higher water quality standards in perpetuity, right? Whether it's native, whether it's, some of these underworkings of the ground, or maybe, a newly amended permit to a mine or a new mine, right? There's a whole breadth here. And so I'm just reading through this and making sure that the intention isn't so deep that it misses, it really truly does make it possible, the ability to meet certain water quality standards that were likely intended to be in perpetuity and protected, when you are not the agency that makes those standards.
I'll now try to take a stab at answering that, and I guess jump in if I'm not completely.
Sorry, it's not a
understanding
very,
the
it's not an easy,
it's
it's not an easy
fine.
discussion.
3.1.6. 1B
Yes,
exists right now in regulations, so all the compliance, all that exists now, so that's pre-existing language.
yeah, not a question about that one.
All of the applicable water quality standards that are in place now is all the division can implement and enforce. So obviously we can't regulate for a yet to be set standard. So I think your question, if I understand it right, is could a rule such as what we're offering up here somehow have either unintended or unknown consequences as those water quality standards change?
Or were
years down the
previously
road?
set.
Well, and if they're
So if they're previously set, do you agree that, what is the standard for lead or
yeah.
something, right?
I mean, all of those are established by Water Quality Control Division Commission. The division has no jurisdiction to establish those surface water discharges. So we implement those as they are in effect now. So if an application is submitted and under applying those standards, it appears that it will be a required perpetual discharge, perpetual treatment, I think that would fall within this subparagraph 5. I'm not sure that the inclusion of this new subparagraph 5, it's not going to change how the division currently reviews and regulates things. I think right now, without this regulation in place, they would still review those standards and would still like to reach the technical determination and conclusion. This application is going to require perpetual treatment. So I don't think that this regulation changes that level of analysis of the division. What this regulation does is really codifies the practice of the division. If they review an application and their technical determination is it's going to be a perpetual treatment situation, this rule now says it shall not issue. Russ, I don't know.
Yeah, and I just wanted, Russ means for the division, I just wanted to add in that we have had situations and stuff where we have a mine site and stuff that has, as an implementing agency, of course, we have to defer and stuff to the CDPHE and the standards do change. Stream standards change and stuff and that, and they go from one standard to another, which makes it more stringent. And what happens there and stuff is the division does have to work with the operator and stuff and that to figure out how, as the implementing agency, that operator is going to comply with that. And there's a number of instances where those standards have been changed or are projected to change. And we're working with those operators to figure out what those impacts are. I don't think this changes that.
So you don't feel like that's material to how you would already be reviewing
That's correct.
certain amendments or certain permits?
Yeah.
I just want to make sure, because I hear why we've been trying to work through some of the language, we're trying to capture that, but then I'm going into the other piece of it too, and I'm also thinking about some of the public comment this morning, and just kind of really want to shine a light that just because we're having a conversation right now with DRMS does not mean that there's not, maybe for those that are not in mining every single day, a whole host of agencies and regulatory agencies and, things happening, that this is not like the buck stops here kind of stuff. So
And that's where the nervousness
Yeah.
is stemming. It's not gonna be an immediate violation. There's a process where you help the operator get in compliance.
Yeah, in many cases, it's something, technically it could be a violation because they're not meeting the new standard. But we don't go in, we don't come bring them before the board or anything. We work with them and stuff to figure out how we're going to meet that new standard and stuff there. So we also, part of our processes and stuff for groundwater, we go way down around here. We set numerical protection limits and stuff for water in our water monitoring programs and everything else. That's all part of some of the stuff that's hidden in the background that will be in a guidance document. And that, but that's some of the things and stuff. And over time, some of even our own numerical protection limits and stuff that we set 10, 15 years ago, when we go back to and review those and stuff in that, in another amendment process or something where it touches on that, we'll review that. And if we need to make adjustments and stuff in that, then we'll address that with the operator. So just because we set an MPL now, 10 years down the line, conditions change, or or even 5 years, whatever, and stuff, and that we're addressing that with the operators and stuff up front. But I don't think that this just kind of codifies that in a way and stuff, and I don't think it hinges on that process.
I didn't mean to digress too much, but I just want to make sure that we had all the different fields trying to get there. Okay.
Anything else in this part E? My last comment is mostly just to address kind of just a drafting error that Mr. Parsons pointed out, that the changes, and this is on that kind of 3-page that we provided the red line, the changes to the rule 6.3.4, 6.4.5, 6.4.7, that should be F through H to include all of the full 1113 language. As we were drafting and messing with 3.1.6, some of the
I think maybe did you add E and
We
then
added E
change
in
the other
something.
things, but you've already referenced the other one? Okay, but
Yeah.
essentially,
Yeah.
we're all literally on the same page.
Yeah, and both parties were helpful in kind of pointing out anytime the division tried, or the intent was to incorporate the verbatim statutory language, sometimes we missed a few things. Got a little loose with amendment when it should have been reclamation plans. They helped us clean those up. So this, I think, falls in that category.
So we have that captured correctly as it.
So that should be F,
F.
did you say?
F through H, correct? And then just the last note, I think it's in there, but CMA raised again that new subpart I, we did leave out the unless otherwise exempt by these rules language, so we'll make sure that's back in there as well.
And I believe, I think that was just a copying and
It's a copy
formatting,
and paste.
versioning thing, but was originally in there, just got lost somewhere.
It was originally in the Secretary of State published version, and then as we kind of were working through Google Docs, transferring them to a PDF, it fell off and didn't do a full copy. So it's, as it was published in the Secretary of State, it'll appear in the rules that you all have as your proposed draft for publication.
Is there anything else? Anything else from the division?
Unless the board just has general question, we kind of use the rest of our time just to fill any questions. Obviously, there were far more changes to these rules than were kind of raised in previous statements. Mike did a good job of talking about some of the catch-all provisions and changes. Some questions on those. Available to answer whatever questions you might have.
I think there was one on page 41 under that the Western Small Myers brought up that I thought was appropriate, 113(2)(6), where they asked for the removal of or token. There's only minimal activity in the size.
For
And
that,
I was going through that too. I thought token is in the eye of the beholder, right? It just seems duplicative.
And I think there, if we could just, since we are in the spirit of capturing proposed, okay, so actually, yeah,
I could jump in before we start to cross our bifurcated hearing.
Sure.
You may reserve that for tomorrow's hearing as it relates to TC and production.
Okay.
There would likely be some other changes like that tomorrow.
And all the other, and the development, production, and mining operations stuff comes to.
Although, I mean, mining operation. Yeah, off on those tomorrow.
perfect. So token only shows up in the TC factors,
Correct.
okay, even though we got talked about today. Okay. Anything else, questions from the board? Still have an opportunity for closing comments.
Questions?
I don't think any other questions, I think
Thank you.
just compiling notes here. While we're pulling that together, if Mr. Parsons, you and your team want to become unmuted again, we'll have 5 minutes for a closing statement.
Thank you. I appreciated all that discussion. I think it's really helpful. Everyone's sort of on the same page. Just to note that there's no objection on this side with that sort of clarifying language that was just discussed on the back end of subparagraph I. And also, I think we suggested the little typo that Jeff Fugate just mentioned, F through H. I think I said F through I, but F through H gets us the same place, so that's not an issue. Again, back to E. I'm encouraged, I guess, to hear that no one thinks of this as an exemption and it's just an information gathering exercise. That makes me feel better about it. I do question why why it's in there if it's just an information gathering. I guess it does no harm. I did like board member Duncan's suggestion to make it explicit. And I think that would erase the concern we have about it. I do think that if there is a provision that says, as I didn't have time to write down the exact language, but something to the effect of nothing in subparagraph E would exempt an applicant from complying with, I think it would have to say F, not just I, because I is the no perpetual treatment requirement, but F is really the demonstration requirement, which is sort of what gets us to I. So if there is language saying that E does not exempt an operator from subparagraph F, then I think that's acceptable. That's a compromise I'm certainly willing to live with.
Mr. Parson, just because we can see it up on the screen here, you are okay keeping I, so as it says now, this is not intended as an exemption to 3.1.6 parent 1 parent I. Do you want it to say parent F parent I?
Yes.
Okay, we're just.
I wanted to F comma I or F or I.
Okay, so we're just Travis's.
And I don't see that screen, unfortunately. I don't know.
Yeah, so it says this is not intended as an exemption to 3.1.6 parent 1 parent F or parent I.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Taking notes here. Any other comments?
Not from me. Thank you very much.
Okay. Just closing comments. I don't think it precludes us from asking questions, but if you have any. Okay, thank you very much. Closing comments from Colorado Mining Association. We will unmute presenters, and they will also have 5 minutes to make a closing statement.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think what we would ask that you not discard our suggested amendments to E. It sounds like several of you are coalescing around, I guess it was board member Duncan. I don't have the voices in my head because the sound is garbled on my laptop, but since it makes it clear it's not an exemption, I don't know what the concern would be for not including the language that CMA suggested for E as a part of the information gathering effort. So I would ask for your consideration of that. And I would also ask again to look at the statement of basis and purpose language that CMA suggested on page 11 of its pre-hearing statement about these issues. I think minor tweaking, but I think it's friendly with what the discussion has been and what I'm hearing as a direction. And the reason for that is there is this existing mine issue that we're all going to have to learn more about. And I think the more data and information we have, the smarter we'll be as this evolves. Thank you so much for hearing us.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Means. Yeah, exactly, yeah.
We're not on the list, but
I got you written down. Closing statement from the division, you also have 5 minutes.
Yeah. I thought you were smart. Yeah.
sorry about that. Again, Jeff Hewitt here for the division. And for those virtually, my apologies that the sound is not coming through when I speak. I'll do my best to, although our closing is short, to talk clearer the rest of today and tomorrow. Division, just again, remind the board, this is a very full rulemaking process with very involved stakeholder group. worked very collaboratively together, which I think generated a very good draft for you all to consider with just a few changes that were discussed today. So the division would just request that you adopt this draft as proposed. Procedurally, I'm not sure, and so I'll kind of defer to Chuck on, are we doing deliberations today? Are we doing it all tomorrow morning? Is there time tomorrow for board members to consider what was discussed today and have more discussion tomorrow? What's the planning process here?
Yeah, so what I was thinking was that it probably made sense not for the board to vote on anything today, because I don't think we can do that piecemeal preferably, but I think it's appropriate for the board to kind of, deliberate on and essentially bookmark, come to a consensus as to where they think the rules, as discussed and debated today, kind of land, and then we'll have that kind of reflected in this red line that can then be picked up tomorrow at the close of all testimony, when there's debate and but deliberation and an actual motion on the full subject. It's kind of what I was thinking.
The vision as your staff will keep track of the red line changes. We'll make sure that whatever consensus is reached by the board today, we'll share with all the parties that have that. Thank you.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
sorry. We would like to request a short recess of 5 or 10 minutes so that we can get things set up so that we can share the red line screen with all the parties. It'll just
Okay.
take us a couple of minutes and stuff there. Yeah, so whenever you're ready.
Okay, and I'm just confirming with, that, do we need to officially, back to what Mr. Fugate was saying in process, formally close testimony in a sense, so that we can essentially compile the notes and agree what we thought we all heard?
Yeah,
Do I need to do something formally in that sense right now?
I think the board could continue the testimonies tomorrow
Okay.
and go ahead and deliver it. That
Okay.
works.
So yeah, before we do that recess, let me do this. I think what we'll do right now is, we've heard the testimony from, the various commentators, and we've heard the last witness. So since we do not have any more testimony on today's subject, I would like to entertain a motion at this time to continue the presentation of testimony until tomorrow. Do you have a motion for that?
Motion to continue testimony to tomorrow, please.
In a second,
Second.
all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Okay, so we will continue formal presentation and testimony of this tomorrow. And then before we close for today, the board is going to deliberate, I guess, for lack of a better term, kind of continue on this conversation like we did. We're going to take a short 5-minute recess so that we can change some of the technology in here so that those listening virtually can see the red line statements as we just capture what we've kind of been attempting to capture all day long. It's fresh. Okay, so 1:30. And Cam, you're fine to leave things running and going? No, you're turning things off. Okay.
Just for the 5 minutes. that we're on. Yes, I'll do that right now. Oh my gosh.
I think what we want to do is stuff.
So that's just some.
Okay, we're good.
All right, so we are just back here to essentially discuss and capture the notes that we heard today. Can we confirm that those on the screen can see the red line?
Not
Not yet, I'm working on being able to see it.
Sharing the screen.
Sharing the screen, okay. Someone
I don't
on
think
screen
share
maybe,
screen
Mr.
I
Mott, can
didn't.
you confirm you can see the red line?
No, I don't see
No,
it.
Melissa can't see it yet. He was still
No.
working on it.
Oh, turn on the camera.
It works now.
Okay. See me now, all right. So essentially, just I think we'd like to take this time to, we've heard some closing statements, we captured some of the notes here. I don't know that I've got any real structure to this, except that, oh, and I think we were gonna try to somehow, Russ, you suggested if we could, as we kind of talk through some things, say, generally, we accept that this is probably some draft language, or there was something about this that we want to flag for tomorrow, just we've got some comments in here.
We will put anything you want, we will put in as a comment on the side there and stuff. If you accept this things the way they are, we can put that in there. We can strike out something if you're, and that we can do whatever you want and stuff up here. So.
Before we get in deep, Mr. Sanderson said something in his closing statement that he didn't want us to discard the suggested amendment to E. And wanted this paragraph included. It's on page 11 of their pre-hearing statement. It's a pretty large paragraph. He kind of said it in passing, but we never talked about it. Can someone help me with, did these capture those comments?
Those are edits to the statement of basis and purpose.
So are we okay here?
The language that they were suggesting and stuff we put up there and that in the middle there is aware that the amendment may impact the hydrological balance. That part and stuff of that is their suggested language. And stuff and that from what they proposed and stuff yesterday or Monday. Jeff, is that correct? Yeah, I think so.
So it's okay.
Yeah, so every time there are rules that are passed, there has to be a statement of basis and purpose that sort of describes, a couple things. Authority for the rulemaking that fits within the statute, things like that. And it can be specific or more general. And I think what Mr. Sanderson is referencing in terms of proposed changes to the statement of basis and purpose, those aren't, the statement of basis purpose doesn't set the rule. Obviously the rules that are on the screen do. It's kind of important more for justification for the change in rulemaking and making sure by the shorthand that the agency is kind of checked the boxes for its authority to adopt a particular set of rules. And oftentimes it's sort of a breadcrumb trail as to the
So do you feel like there's any action necessary just in this capturing of notes or thoughts or anything that we need to address that comment?
I don't believe so.
Right now.
Basis and statement. The one that we provided to the Secretary of State stuff was kind of broad, and part of what we had when we submit these for final publication and stuff, we will look at everything and stuff and come up with a more definitive statement and stuff after that final draft.
Okay.
So, but it's duly noted.
So do we just want to go down the line here of just, in the red line and just take them one at a time and make sure that what we have in our notes is what we think was captured, or if we want to, insert other words that would be more appropriate for consideration? We're not adopting anything today. We're just capturing what we said. So I think the first one that was up in really the main point of discussion on one side, there was a proposal to strike that, right? There was the language from the division, which is for the most part in red, and then amended language by CMA in the industry, and then further amended by board member Duncan, which is also in blue. I don't know, does it matter? We want to have fun colors. Do you
I
want to
can
leave,
change it.
do you want to leave CMA in blue bold? Since other people can see this, on the call. And yeah, put the other one in, pick your favorite color. Just so we can see the differences.
Just not.
Anything, green. All right. Okay, so, and then can you make a comment too, just so that we don't forget that there was also a proposal to strike this entirely? So essentially, there's sort of four options.
Motion to strike.
Yeah. Okay. Anything that has not been captured here that someone has in their notes that needs to make sure we've got an interpretation or unintended consequence or further discussion?
I kind of have a comment.
Okay.
I appreciate the language trying to satisfy anyone and everyone. But sometimes it occurs to me that I wonder if, trying to make it as specific as possible, but could this language be reinterpreted as the nature of the board changes? Different members sitting on the board looking at language like that and coming to a different conclusion than we did. Is it a possibility, or?
I think that's probably always a risk on any board makeup, right? Whether it's how you interpret the rules or how you interpret what an operator's doing. I'm sure the intent is to try to make it as universally intended as it possibly can, but I don't think you're wrong to say that that's probably the nature of all boards, right?
So I have a feeling trying to make it as specific as possible is a good idea.
Do you have any edits to it that you think would help make it more concise? No? Anyone else reading it, if we didn't have all these colors up there, say anything that would help it be more concise?
I have a concern about the material effect language that I brought up to CMA, but if I'm hearing a lot of concern and anxiety, the word being anxiety, right, on the behalf of operators to try to do the right thing, meet the requirements, meet division expectations, uphold their permit requirements, etc. Adding more ambiguous language makes that harder in my mind. If I was an operator, I know my site in, out, backwards, upside down, whatever. I think it's not a material effect, from my opinion. And then I can definitely see the conflict between trying to defend that as an operator,
Yeah.
and then whether it's ourselves as board, division, what have you, saying, no, we really think this is a material effect. But it's an opinion at a certain point.
Do you think that because you propose this language of, hey, but this is not an exemption to I or F, to F or I,
Yeah,
because that does get more specific, do you think you, to your point, need the word material? Because I hear what you're saying, right? I may think that, oh, this is no problem, I'm fine. I know my operation, I know how I do things. Someone else who really doesn't want me to do this is the way you interpret the word material.
Yeah.
Even though I don't think that's the intent of why CMA is trying to put that word in
No.
there.
No, of course not.
Yeah,
Yeah, I actually feel like what I was adding at the end of this was really just to address the original conversation of should we strike E entirely, and does it create this loophole? Or does it not, and how to like ensure that it's not creating that loophole? It's what I was adding is not necessarily addressing CMA's addition.
Okay.
It was not intended to address CMA's addition, so. Guess I'd be fascinated to know what everyone else thinks about it.
yeah.
The problem with the Zoom meeting is everybody that's on Zoom can't see what your wheels turning.
I know.
I feel like we should narrate.
I-
The wheels are turning.
The wheels are turning.
Russ, how implementable is that in the group? From the DNR standpoint?
When we looked at the language and stuff in that, we, our position and stuff is, we put that in there as board member Duncan pointed out and stuff. It's not, we're not looking for an exemption, we're just wanting to make sure and stuff that it's codified in there and stuff that we can take a look at that. This language and stuff that's proposed and stuff, the division doesn't support it. And the reason we don't is because we think it opens up rights too much in our opinion. So that's our opinion, stuff and that is that language opens up conservation has a point, if you will, and stuff that it kind of opens up that conversation and stuff and that to the point where we're looking at exemptions, even with the language that's there that says it's not supposed to be great. It's one of those things doesn't add value or not, and at this point, the stuff our position is it doesn't really add value and stuff to me.
So if the blue goes away, E is an addendum that when you, an addendum comes in, it says like we don't think this is just a little bump up or like the circumstance that Jim mentioned. It's pretty black and white. You can look at it and say there's not really an impact on the hydrologic balance. Where the blue opens up to say, well, we'll take a teeny tiny, but not a, and it's more of a judgment call on that.
It's kind of a little bit, the blue kind of opens it up to where, from both aspects and stuff, that you want stuff that in the review and stuff, it could open it up to where we could gives us too much authority as opposed to too much discretion. And that is in relation to the intent and stuff. And so we're trying to stay very narrow, because the one thing we don't want to do is cross the line and stuff, and that where under either judicial review or even under our DORA review and stuff of state regulatory, we get it kicked back and stuff that says that that's not the intent of the legislation. And our language is stuff we try to craft very carefully where we're not getting into the gray areas and stuff, and this proposed language is something that kind of pushes us into that gray areas and stuff, and that's what causes this problems.
Mr. Monk, I can't tell if you're wanting to make a comment, but just before you do that, if you do, could we, Russ, you said something about blue insertions that I'm trying to remember what it exactly was. I was just gonna put a comment within that for tomorrow.
Okay.
How do you characterize that language? You said it was not
Not supported by.
not value added. So you said
It's not value added, and we feel that pushes it into the gray area and stuff, and that's where it's potentially stuff in conflict with the statute.
okay. Thank you. Saying I can't remember.
If that makes sense.
Okay. Mr. Monk, did you have some commentary?
Yeah, I do. Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I wonder, I'm interested in staff's opinion. If you go back to the original language, but you keep the and approval by the office and the board. And one, in that approval, we or the office kind of makes the case for why we are accepting that. And over time, we also build some history kind of behind that in terms of how that is applied or not, and that gives us some sort of standing to kind of work off of as we work through this.
Okay, so you're suggesting that, you know, as we're going through this, capturing how these, yeah, what triggers make this an approved, you know, path forward or whatever it may be.
As Mr. Fugate pointed out, this is like a data collection point, if you will.
Yep.
Under rule 6.3 and 6.4, we have the language in there and stuff that requires that they provide this kind of information. This kind of connects the dots between 11, 13 and those requirements. So adding in review and approved by the office and the board and stuff, certainly that helps strengthen that. So to make a point and stuff that we're reviewing it and making a decision on it. And of course, as also pointed out, is stuff, anything that's a decision and stuff that the division makes and stuff is always appealable to the board for the discussion and stuff if somebody disagrees with that from either side, you know, from conservation or industry.
So you are okay with the word "in" approval because do you feel like it helps strengthen?
Yeah, I think so, yes, yeah.
Can we capture that comment as well? Thank you for pointing that out, Mr. Monk. Anything else that you wanted to add to that part of the conversation? Tim? No, okay. All right, so moving, anything else on E for now? No, we are capturing thoughts.
So it sounds like the striking of blue is desired for implementation.
It is not supported by the division. Although the division was okay with the word approval. They didn't feel like it's not even so much that it's not value add. It felt like back to the point of maybe, you know, what Anthony was talking about, if you put too much in there, the additional interpretation to potential different word makeups could cause other unintended consequences as well. Nothing to say we can't go back to this if someone sees something and wants to go back, but I just want to kind of keep moving along here. I think that all we really did in F was reference to it several times. Did anyone have anything different there? No, we referenced to F. We talked about the difference between whatever our typing errors were. We're going to make sure it says F through H, correct? Got that? Good. And did we already make that change?
Yeah.
Wherever it was referenced, okay, we were fine there. Little I, we talked. Okay, yep, we captured, so no permit or amendment shall be approved. We were fine with that, right? Capture that one.
Yeah, I guess, does that add any complications for either operators or division there?
No, because we
The
wouldn't.
intent is 2013.
Well, here's the deal, and stuff, if something unintended happens, say you have a mine site that there's no foreseen water issues and stuff, and they hit an aquifer or something that's unknown, you know, you can drill 100 holes, but well, on average, it says you might miss it, right? If they have to come in and do an amendment and stuff in that, in order to address the impacts to that water that they've uncovered, if you will, then that says if you have an amendment, we can't approve it. It may be that the end game there and stuff ends up being perpetual water treatment if there's a constant flow. One of the things, you have a mine that when they were mining and stuff of that, they dug down and they broke through a cap and they hit basically an artesian aquifer. wasn't intended, they had to do an amendment to put in a water treatment plant. And they're still working with that today. So but we had to approve their water treatment plants and everything else, and we're still trying to figure out some way of ending that perpetual water treatment or something there. So that's my only concern there for you guys to consider is that, certainly we have never approved a permit, but conditions could change and stuff where we have to have an amendment that captures that. And by putting that in there, we may be putting ourselves into a box we can't get out of. And that's my fear.
Yeah, I guess I added the words or amendment so that they referenced each other nicely,
Right.
like E hit I. But I totally hear what you're saying, like unexpected consequences, and what are you gonna do? You can't like not treat that flow. I think the intention of 1113 is all water on site, is intended to address all water on site for the forever future. Whether that's intended or unintended. I wouldn't be heartbroken if we don't put or amendment in there. I think I just wanted it to be really clear that E was intended to talk to I, and that those things should go together. I don't know how to adjust that language to address what you just said, Russ, like, unforeseen circumstances, and the right thing to do is put in treatment.
Well, because you added that unless otherwise exempt by these rules, do you need the word amendment in there? Because what he's talking about is amendment potentially puts them in a box that they can't really get themselves out of.
Yeah.
But leaving unless otherwise exempt by these rules
Right.
could say, hey, this happened. They didn't mean to do it. Now we're here. We gotta fix it.
Yeah.
They didn't officially mean to come in with an amendment, but that was the mechanism that they had to use in order to get to that place. Is that make you feel comfortable?
It makes me feel like it hits the intended purposes. That the two paragraphs are clear, that they reference one another, the intention is clear. But there's still the opportunity to go back in and address what you need to address on site, and you're covered otherwise. So yeah, I would be happy to take or amend it out, as long as we keep that the final language, which is already in there.
Can we strike amendment just to capture it?
Yeah.
And then can we put unless otherwise exempt by these rules in green, so we remember that was an addition. How that is thinking about.
Hey Travis.
Yeah.
Go back to. Go down next to,
Bold italic.
next to bold italic, you see that strike through?
Yeah, right
Just
there.
to your right.
Oh, right there.
Right
there.
Okay,
Yeah,
got it.
there you
Thank you. And then where would you like me to add?
Unless otherwise exempt by these rules, put that in that bold green. No, down.
No, that's very, yeah, it's already there.
Yeah.
Was that CMA? I thought it was one.
No,
No, it was
that was
CMA?
that was
Okay.
CMA addition. That was one of the things that got lost in our
Okay, blue. Oh, no, it's fine. This is nothing.
Yeah, this was.
It got lost in the trans. Okay, so it's fine. We're
It's
good.
fine.
We're good. Got it. More discussion on that one?
You guys comfortable with that?
Okay, so it's essentially how it was.
Yes.
Find the different page numbers. We're gonna be back to those two next on conversation. I think that was it, because token stays tomorrow. And
We want to talk about any of the general edits or anything like that, just to say comfortable, not comfortable.
just overall, even though it wasn't brought up in specific discussion.
We can go, take us right back up to the beginning definitions. Right here. as we noted, it's some, the reason we added in extracted metallurgical processes to affected lands was to tie in billing as part of mine of the operations and stuff that were there. Because we had in previous hearings before the board and other discussions and stuff, we've had people claiming that billing's not part of mining. And for a while, it's sub CDPHE did do custom billing, but for our revised demos, and then we'll change in 2019, we took back over that authority. So this is just time to connect those dots.
And just for the record, I'm sure that these conversations, you had multiple stakeholder conversations.
Yes,
so
they were all part of.
we talked through this, and ultimately what we ended up discussing today was really all that bubbled up to the surface for some
Correct, yeah.
deliberation here, but all these others, there wasn't. You've landed on language that people were all in agreement on.
I believe so, yes,
Okay.
yeah.
So does that also affect production?
Good, what?
Does that have any effect on production?
It will, not in production and stuff, and that it will tie into that because it ties into mining operations. When we get down to mining operations, we actually have the term milling in there. And for some conversations and stuff, we might suggest putting milling and other extracted metals part of the processing that way connects the dots, but we'll get there in just a second.
So
Yeah.
just a geeky engineer
Uh-huh.
thing is you have capital E, capital M, capital P. But not capital M mining, capital operation, even though they're defined.
Okay, we can fix that.
And just
No,
because.
No, that's fine. It's-
Throughout
yeah.
the regulations,
We want to be consistent
Yeah.
in that, so like I said, you look at these 10,000 times, it starts this. So just make that a capital.
Well, then you gotta go through the whole text and make them caps, because they are not caps. So I think you should make it little e, little m, little p.
Just make it all, just leave it all little.
That's, I mean, when you use production and mining operations throughout the rules, it's all under, it's all little cap.
And I was, and Chuck, this may be a question to you as well. I think the regs are not good at consistently capitalizing defined terms, which is proper. We could go through and try to do that or not. I defer to you, Chuck, on capitalizing defined terms throughout the regs.
May I comment on that? There's a lot of, like, when you talk about in situ mining operations, it doesn't really mean in situ mining operations. It was very loose going through the regs.
Yeah, part of that is like the in situ language came straight from statute. So, yeah, it was the legislature that did that, so that's, yeah, you have multiple authors, multiple, yeah. So.
Do you want to just put in a comment about capitalizing or not capitalizing defined
We,
terms?
yeah, we certainly can go, we can certainly go through and canvass it and try to catch as much of it as possible and stuff once we're done. And that, well, yeah, we know the areas and stuff where it is and stuff, and we may miss one or two, but we can catch that.
Well,
It's up to you guys.
Yeah, I think it's the scope of the image, because we have like fixed grammatical.
Yeah, it certainly is there, so we can fix that, so.
It's just,
What?
how big of a lift is it for you guys to go do all that tonight?
Oh, I wasn't suggesting that.
No, this is and the other thing is, for instance, amendment is a definition. And it's not capitalized throughout. It's a pretty big.
Maybe we save that for a later date. So we'll be back.
Before those.
Yeah.
Some days, but that's something that's something we can put on our next list. And I have some specialists that are really great at those kinds of things.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's something we can fix tonight. And our goal is to approve everything tomorrow. I don't think we could approve that. You can approve that. So,
Yeah.
Tomorrow, we have 4 options on certain things. Maybe this helps us. We're gonna deliberate on all or some of the rules, right? I think that's probably what we'd like to do. We want to vote. That's what we'd like to do. We don't know what's gonna happen. There's an option to defer discussion on a rule to different, comments or testimony. You can send a rule or rules back to the division for additional work. So there is an option where in this case, this capitalization, we don't have to do something tonight. With it, you could understand the implications of capitalized or not. And we could vote to send that portion of the rules back to you for work.
I have, how would that affect the effective date? I mean, do we have to do that and then turn around and bring it back for final approval, which would be in June, or June?
Okay.
Yeah, I think the issue we run into that is sort of like kind of the piecemeal, which is what Russ was getting at with the effective date. And it's sort of, I mean, I think it's ultimately the board's call. How important is it to the board to have the, kind of consistent capitalized defined terms? If doing that is important enough to kind of put off the effective date of all the rest of the rules that we've kind of been chewing on for a while now, that's fine. But it might just be, another option is to just, as Russ said, bring it up for a subsequent rulemaking that can be kind of very streamlined where, we get the rules that they've worked hard on getting consensus on, filed, get an effective date. Because we have an administrative lag time from when the board adopts, when we file, to when they become effective, that we're already, we already have to work backwards from. And so, my recommendation would be to think about is having consistently capitalized defined terms important enough right now to kind of put off the effective date that we're working towards currently, or would it be preferable, and it's board's call, would it be preferable to sort of come back and do that in sort of a, rulemakings don't usually take this long. We, this don't usually have a pandemic in between when you start and you finish, and obviously something, nothing's ever completely simple, but something like defined terms could be done in a pretty expedited way. But it's entirely up to pleasure of the board.
Yeah, I don't think it's worth, I personally don't think it's worth stalling the process, but when you get into mining operations, production, development, I think it is important in the long term. Make sure the capitalizations.
And not to get in the weeds with that anymore, but with amendment, that could be confusing too. It's like an amendment to the bill, or is it amendment to the rules? That could get a little, that could be interpreted either way,
Permit commitments.
Yeah.
We've got 3 different kinds of amendments.
Right, or permit.
I would suggest the stuff that you allow staff and that to take some time and stuff. And what we can do, maybe like what Chuck suggested, we can turn this over and stuff to a couple of staff members and stuff like that, and go through it with that particular aspect in mind. And then all it is and stuff is, we post it, and then we bring it before the board as an item, and there should not be any discussion and stuff of that stakeholder or whatever. And after this is an editorial change, it's not a substantive change, and I wouldn't see any need for big hearings such as what we have going on now. It'd be more just an administrative kind of approval and stuff like that. That's amenable to.
Can we do all the other setting of the clock things? If we approve the rules tomorrow, you can do that and they can still do this editorial.
Yeah, it would just be a separate rulemaking
Okay.
to kind of address that, give the division time. Because I mean, it is more complicated than just hitting Control F or Control H and finding a place that, someone's gonna have to think through what does this actually mean in this context? And as Russ said, it would come before the board as another rulemaking, but, you know, it wouldn't take 2 days of rulemaking hearing to complete it. It would be presumably this, something like that is not the sort of thing that requires or, you know, really excites stakeholders. It's sort of administrative.
Yeah.
Could probably go pretty seamlessly.
But I appreciate Jill pointing that out, because if you are getting deep into something, you want to know, we're talking about production or production.
Right.
So, okay, so I don't know what the note is that we want to do, but just flagging that we will
I have it on my notes here.
administratively review. Yeah, that we don't want to do that yet. You have to say editorial administrative review for later rulemaking. And then maybe in the motion somehow formally, when we're adopting the rules, we may want to consider or not consider, you know, defer to you on your preference. It makes it confusing. Whether we acknowledge that language or,
Double check question.
Yes, we'll figure it
Yeah, either way.
whatever you think makes sense.
We'll put it on our task list and say.
We are not trying to stall the process.
Well, then that was just the implication there. So if we
Yeah.
want us to do that, we gotta have time to do that.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
pushes, that drives us into which.
No, we don't,
Right.
So, okay,
not the intent. Okay, thank you for catching that. All right, moving on.
Yeah, do we wanna look at every edit, or do we wanna just talk about like key parts?
it's up to you, so.
Anything you want to talk
Is there
about?
anything here and stuff? Yeah, if there's something, we'll scroll slowly
Yeah,
in that. And if there's something and stuff that any board member wishes to discuss or something and stuff, if not, we'll assume that we're okay.
yeah, I guess maybe, did wanna, well, I'm gonna totally derail your scrolling.
Alright.
I wanted to jump to page 89. So that we can focus on sort of the language that refers to HB 191113. One of the key tenets of that was eliminating self-bonding. Yeah, so there was a lot of language on this page that's kind of struck out in our version here around self-insurance, credit rating, some of the language that Mr. Cunningham mentioned earlier of credit rating of A or what have you.
Yeah.
So just sort of an acknowledgement on our part that we see that intention of the bill being represented in the edits here, and it's in multiple places. I think
Yeah.
that was just the biggest one that I saw.
You said page 89?
It is, and
It's real 4.10.
yes.
4.10.
Thank you, yeah. And you just have reserved, oh, no, there you are, yeah, thank you.
Okay,
Yeah, so just sort of acknowledgement, I recognize and I remember the conversations around this, that, you know, industry was comfortable with that adjustment. You know, I know it's very clear in the bill itself. So no edits or anything, but just that's a lot of language changed and I'm comfortable.
okay, so maybe on this side is something that we just put accepted. Or no one accepted.
And that the division presented the context for it in saying that. I mean, what did you say? Used it once or hadn't ever used it or something?
Yeah, there was one case where we had one operator, and actually when 1113 was passed, they were already working on changing it over, so they changed it over with 6 months. So they actually did report it. Effectively.
And then screwing it up all over again. Back to, let's see, so it's gonna be near page 32 for you, I guess.
Yeah, we had some really-
Yes, it's 1.6.2, Karen. So it's like 1.6.2 in general. So it's around that public notice that we were discussing earlier. I know the rules are doing what they can to address that and to say, we need to be a little bit more online and as transparent as humanly possible. Totally hear you that you're not gonna reach every single person, and that's a really difficult ask, but I would ask my fellow board members if we have any brain cells to contribute to how we can share out this information better as members of communities that are impacted by mines. How do we as community members get that information? How would we like to get that information? How could we help distribute that? Just, it's a tall order, and I hear the language that the rules doing the best they can, but yeah.
That's bothered me a long time. For the record, I want to say that, we're putting little people out of business, not just agency here, but across our country. And, that little gold miner that had that twinkle in his eye 150 years ago in Colorado. Those days are gone. But anyway, so I really appreciate what's been drawn here. I just, we elaborate what we're doing so much that the only people who can function in this deal are somebody that's going to hire an engineer or lawyer. Anyway, that's my frustration. I think where we've gotten to is pretty good, but I don't feel comfortable. Anyway, on this, have we explored the mail at all? Can we put, what we see a lot of times, and we see them in our hearings, is, oh, I met the standard. The standard isn't good enough in Colorado. We get 5.5 million people here. And we kind of have to, and I don't know how we do it. I'm talking a dreamland. We need to have an adaptive sort of management. And I've pushed you guys to try and, hey, let's work this out or let's predict that. And you've done a good job. We need to do that. I like to have an attitude where people wouldn't be afraid to call Russ and say, hey, I might have a problem out here. I want to talk to you first. I don't know how we get there. I know we got to do this stuff. There's always those real people that break the rules. But anyway, the mail, and I'm wondering, we got to put as 200 feet for a sign. I think we need to ignore that. And if there's a place around the neighborhood you need to put up a sign, let's look at doing that. And if it's, if we need to put a 4x8 sign up, fine. I just think we need to look at those options. It's a different world we live in than when they wrote these things years ago. So I think people fairly should be able to know about what's happening to them. The 200 feet might not, that's nothing. I mean, just some of the thoughts that crossed my mind, and I think we need to explore those kind of options. And anyway,
including mailers with like utility company or like municipal.
Yeah, somebody could research the neighbor. I mean, we do it politically, so I know you can find the addresses this way. Maybe, and I don't know, it may not be worthwhile, but even a renter probably should know what's going to happen to it next door.
What about like a public posting? Like, I hear pushback sometimes on mailers where people say, oh, it's so expensive, or like, I didn't know, I didn't get it to everybody in time or whatever.
There's no expense. These guys
I'm glad we have your support and stuff for fee increases.
Yeah, what about posting like at a post office, right? Like my whole community, we're PO boxes, we always go into the post office.
I'm afraid to go in there. I think I might see my picture. That's right.
Well, the rest of us go into the post.
I hear what you're saying, and I agree with, the thing with the newspaper thing that came up was pretty specific, where the operator said, yes, we did the thing you told us to do. The problem is that the newspaper industry has changed, and people don't read it in print. Not everyone is sophisticated enough to have their entire thing on e-edition. If it's behind a paywall, you don't get it. So just to say the newspaper is no longer the proper definition. But just like you said, we're putting, the twinkle in their eyes out of business. I don't want to be prescriptive as to what stakeholder engagement means for an operator. I mean, I will speak very transparently that this is my role for a wonderful operation, and it is a huge lift, not just on my shoulders, but on everyone's shoulders. It's coordinated and incredibly successful, but it is not one size fits all. And I do hope that an operator has the trust with DRMS to say, hey, we're trying to do this. Can you walk me through what another operator did when they were trying to do something of the scale? Can you tell me why so-and-so was successful getting that permit amended, and how did they navigate this? Or can you tell me about a pitfall that happened when someone did only talk to the two neighbors that were 250 feet away and found out that they had 600 other friends that were interested in what was going on? So I don't think you can. It has to be the intent, and the world is going that way too, right? I mean, ESG initiatives, social investing, green investing, anyone who's in anything knows that you have got to have social license to operate today. So,
But it's even different, like community to community, right? Like
Totally.
if you're talking about the proposed mine that was in the Blue River, that's a very wealthy community that is able to really represent themselves, to take the time to be at these hearings, to take a day off of work. That might be very different if you're looking at another community that doesn't have that flexibility or that time or what have you. So I like your approach of saying, like, coordinate that through your division representative. You're going to be working with one way or another.
Yeah.
Um,
in your community, it's the post office.
Right.
I mean, in ours, like, forget it.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be helpful at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I even kind of saw it in the public comment this morning, which I was really glad to see that we had public comment, but it was very specific to something happening in their backyard. I don't know if they had not had a proposed activity happening in their backyard, would they have shown up to the general Hard Rock rulemaking hearings? I'm not saying they wouldn't, but I think that there was sort of like a, hey, our antenna's up because of this thing in my backyard. And that's how they, wanted to engage, which is great. But it was only from a very certain sector of the community that we heard from.
Looking at it globally.
Yes.
If you will, and that, Hard Rock is about 15% of our total permits, 85% of that is construction materials. So to have a conversation about, differences in how to do public notice and stuff, and that, I think you need to engage not only members of the public and stuff, but you need to do that with a bigger audience of stakeholders and stuff. And certainly I agree, but having staff go put up notices and stuff, it would be a burden upon the applicant. But staff's not going to drive all the way out to somewhere, just like putting the application into the county clerk's office. A lot of county clerks, they don't even, you call up, they don't even know that it's there, and which is frustrating and stuff. And so, we can do so much, or we can have the applicants do so much. Certainly, if that's the desire of the board, that the discussion and stuff that's outside of really our true scope and stuff today, as far as what we're doing is modernization. But it's something and stuff that we can take a look at and maybe have some further discussions. And I'll reach out to CMAs on the board here on Zoom, and we'll talk to them, talk to CSSGA and others and stuff like that, and see what there's out there. Part of the problem and stuff too is that we have, I know that we've Jenny and I attended some conferences and stuff, and social justice and other things and stuff are rising to the top and stuff, and that with operators and stuff. So that helps. So having a conversation and stuff about ensuring that people and stuff are noticed properly and stuff, that is certainly something that's big. 200 feet, that's what it is. If we need to change that, then that's something that maybe we can have a conversation about. But
Is that in statute or is that legislation?
I think that's by rule. Yeah, I do. Yeah, I think that's actually in rule. I have to go back and take a look at that and see if it's something that's I'm pretty sure it's in rule and stuff like that. So you could expand that, but I can from an industry standpoint, if you expand it from 200 to 500 feet, then people that are 550 or 600 feet.
I understand.
Yeah,
It's not very far.
no, and I understand. Yeah, so maybe that's a further discussion and stuff for us to take a look at, have a conversation and stuff with some stakeholders, and come back to you for a possibly an informational discussion.
But you're right, I wasn't thinking really applies here, not very much.
Yeah.
It's gonna get into gravel pits and stuff.
Yeah. You'll
So
see,
Your point's well taken, 15%.
and you'll see that in the next couple of months.
Yeah, but I think that's a good point. too. Not only are folks, I would say always aware of social justice and the need to communicate with their neighbors, but you know, the conversation starts a lot better if you're a new applicant and your community knows about you, rather than some of the conversations we've heard, which the main public, one of the main public issues seems to be, you didn't tell us in time. So instead of like starting the conversation on the relationship on such a negative foot, you know, you have an opportunity to kind of get out ahead of that and maybe answer questions before a hearing comes up, or what, you know, just that social license operate on a local scale as well as a global one too.
I mean, you've had some operators that have done that, but they walked into a Hornets nest.
Oh,
People
sure.
are pissed off to
Yeah,
begin with,
totally.
no matter what your good intentions
Yeah.
are and stuff, and that, you know, you're gonna get run out on the trail, and then what do you do from there?
I think
Hear you.
in the industry, there's really good proactive operators, and there's some that are less informed or less informed. And what's important to me as being a citizen of Colorado is we don't make it so onerous on the big operators, because they set the bar, and then people see a Freeport or a Newmont doing the right thing, because number one, they have the money and the people to do it, but they say, hey, I should do this better. You know, Mark area that just went through and did a big pit, it was very well done. And leading by example is huge. And sometimes like there's just people I wish that were part of the mining industry, but they still are, right? But it's just, there's no one size fits all here, and we can just try to encourage the good. And it's basic. When you start, you do it with the first drill rig that goes out, you start talking to your neighbors. Understand that, even if the door is shut. We just, how we get that word out is beyond the board, I think, but it's a call, I feel. And that's, you know, through CMA and through Colorado Sand and Gravel, is getting involved in those boards and saying, this is a good example of what you're gonna do, permit with this. You know, you can get in there a little bit earlier.
Yeah,
So
so
some of them just are fit.
I mean, it is choice, right? So I'm hearing like what you just said about leading by example, and is there a way to reward that? Of like, you know, we give the annual awards here for reclamation, could we start thinking about that in more of a social way as well?
Well, if you'll notice on our Starner Awards and stuff, we expanded that and stuff that to include community involvement, coordination, you know, and stakeholders, so that that's one of the key things and stuff that we look at anymore and stuff is, you know, you did a great reclamation project, but it's what you did above and beyond, you know, it's not a participation award, right? You did what you were supposed to in that, so but we take a look at what did you do that went above and beyond by reaching out to your community. And those are the kind of things and stuff that we try to bring forward to the board. So.
Yeah, incentivizing the educational aspect to the community, I think, would be a great way, because then they see it, you know, they're on the ground, they see the people doing the operation, you know, and that brings the human side of it as opposed to it just being this far off operation, but really it's like all your neighbors that work there, you know.
And I think to Jill's point about saying that it's the exploration drill, it's not necessarily always the person with the community hat on. We know that it's the person, it's your safety, it's your environmental, it's the person doing exploration, maybe it's the person just surveying out a land thing there, all the touch points in the community. And I think it's important to show that exactly that is your neighbor, you know, working there, living there, probably quite frankly living where they are because they enjoy being outside and they care about the land, right?
This is not a topic and I'm trying to get on it, but one thing I think we should do is somehow, I don't know how we do the thing that goes in a post office. People need to see the before and after on some of these type of reclamation. People in Colorado don't need to see how great some of these places are. They need to know what, you know, the mining and reclamation, what you guys, the RMS and our operators have done. I mean, it's great. And we get to see them, How many people really get to see them? I don't know how we.
And the intention on like wildlife corridors and things like that too,
Yeah.
like that's awesome.
We put it on the website. We also have another website, Reclamation Colorado. That we put that kind of information and stuff out there. So there's ways and stuff for us to do that. So,
I
So,
I appreciate the conversation.
Yeah.
I think the bottom line is we need to tell our story.
yes.
My operators need to tell their story and DRMS and MLRB need to tell their story as well. Anyone else? We're kind of jumping around here a bit. So we talked about the e-receipt. Looks like we're adding opportunities where possible for the website link. The website's going to be more robust, have more information. That'll be included. Figure out local newspapers at a later date. Anything else on that link there? Lori? Anyone else have anything in their notes that they flagged or a certain rule or page number they wanted to capture right now?
Without monopolizing the conversation more than I feel like I already have. Are there any kind of lingering topics of discussion that we've heard in recent hearings where we've kind of said, oh gosh, we had a chance to amend the rules, this would have been much clearer? Thinking about that as well.
Outside temporary,
Yeah,
We'll get there.
Yeah, we'll get there.
Thanks.
Just
that's been it.
so you're aware, it's if we actually keep a spreadsheet, and that's, and when we're done here, we'll turn around and stuff and that, and staff keeps a running list of a wish list of some things, and we say, no, we can't do that. But there's a lot of things and stuff, we run into issues and stuff and that before the board or something, well, it goes on that list of stuff for us to take into consideration. It's the designated mining, or not, the designated chemicals,
That's the one
that
that
was
comes
one
to
of them.
mind.
And
Yeah.
stuff that was on our list because of things that had come before the board.
Yeah.
And because of our conflicts with with certain people and stuff and that we wanted to make sure our stuff was clear. So we do keep a running list of that, so if anything comes up like that, that you feel that we wanted to take a deeper look at and stuff and that, at any time, at any hearing or something like that, let us know and stuff, and we'll put that on the list and stuff and that for contemplation.
Yeah, that was the one that was kind of my mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one thing I'd say is just as a reminder, I think the discussion's helpful in terms of sort of adding to the division's wish list, but we're limited in scope of what we can do with this set of rules by what we noticed in the rulemaking notice. And so, we are kind of limited to the discussion of what was presented today. Tomorrow we'll do TC in production. These are the kind of cleanup ones for clarification, corrections, or to reflect new information for current practice or procedure. And it sounds like, I sort of the notice discussion, I think.
It's just a discussion.
Yeah, and it
That's all
really,
it is.
really reinforced that we don't have a current practice or technology. And it's something that we have to think about.
Just a discussion.
Start the start of a good discussion that hopefully we can come back at less than 2 years. Good job.
4.5. Okay, so, all right, so I think we're anything else and stuff on today's list?
I just have to say that I know this is the first day, but it felt like a lot of information at first, but then when you capture sort of the discussions and you realize that, they're not insignificant implications to changing certain words, but the work that you have done as staff and the division, and certainly with stakeholders and representative groups, really, really impressive. I think you said, Patrick said many hands make light work, except that the light work was not ever, you guys had a huge heavy lift, and this is really impressive.
Yeah, very well, yeah, kudos to the stakeholders and stuff for way too many meetings, way too many Zoom meetings.
Well, and I just feel like the dialogue between the stakeholders, I can see a lot of scenarios where those two kinds of groups do not have to play well in the sandbox, and I think the discussion was was really respectful, was really thoughtful, really appreciative. And I think that that is not only says something about those individual stakeholders, but because of the interaction you had with them from the get-go, speaking of stakeholder engagement, right? So that, you know, a lot of this has been hashed out and it doesn't have to be contentious or throw someone under the bus to get, you know, to get your point across. So great job. We expect the same results tomorrow.
Sure. Okay.
Okay, so let's see, do I adjourn? Yeah.
I think he's, yeah, you can recess till tomorrow.
Oh, we recessed because we continued, so we will recess and continue this conversation tomorrow at 9 a.m. And those with Zoom links to participate have the Zoom information. Those who wish to follow along on YouTube can do so. We will see everyone else bright and early. Thank you. Thank you.